This episode is brought to you by Charles Schwab. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab. This podcast unpacks the stories making news in Washington and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise.
I'm Josh Klein.
And I'm Elise Hu.
We host a podcast from Accenture called Built for Change.
Every part of every business is being reinvented right now. That means companies are facing brand new pressures to use fast evolving technologies and address shifting consumer expectations.
But with big changes come even bigger opportunities. We've talked with leaders from every corner of the business world to learn how they're harnessing change to totally reinvent their companies.
And how you can do it too.
Subscribe to Built for Change now so you don't miss an episode.
We are 6 weeks into the first of Donald Trump's trials. His adult children have testified. The former president has testified. The prosecution is resting, and now his defense is up to bat. Trump has 4 high-profile criminal cases coming up, but this trial is a civil one. New York Attorney General Letitia James says Trump and his adult sons inflated the value of their properties to lenders and insurance companies. That's fraud, and not just a little fraud.
The claims are that they inflated these assets wildly, sometimes to a factor of 23.
Barbara McQuade is a law professor at the University of Michigan and a former U.S. attorney for Michigan's Eastern District.
This is, as Attorney General Letitia James has said, really largely a documents case. On the one hand, you see what these properties are worth, and then you see representations to lenders and insurers describing those values at much higher numbers. But the testimony is important because it helps to understand how those discrepancies arose.
The testimonies. Prosecutors questioned Trump's sons, Don Jr. and Eric, co-defendants in the case. Ivanka Trump also testified, though she's legally off the hook since she left the family business in 2017. But the most explosive testimony came from their father, the former president. It's important to know that the judge already ruled that Trump and his co-defendants were liable for fraud on at least one count. So now what's at stake is the punishment. The judge could order Trump to pay a hefty fine and could ban him from doing business in New York. So when Trump spent 4 hours answering prosecutors' questions, it got ugly.
I thought Donald Trump's outbursts against the judge were truly remarkable. He said on the stand how the prosecutor is a hack and how the judge is biased and unfair. At one point, even when the judge asked Trump's lawyer could you please get your client under control, the response was, I will not violate my client's First Amendment rights, which is such an absurd response. I mean, in the courtroom, there's no First Amendment right to say whatever you want to say. You're under oath to answer questions truthfully.
I'm thinking about the fact that Trump is also facing 4 criminal trials. And I'm wondering if you heard anything this week that would indicate how he may act in those cases as well.
This is really all just a performance for Donald Trump. This is a show to provide a false narrative to his supporters that he is a victim, that he is being railroaded by prosecutors and the courts, and that he will continue to show that he is above the law. I think he anticipates that he will lose this case. And this way, when he loses, he will be able to say to his supporters, see, I told you all along they had it in for me. And it really does make me wonder whether he won't use the same strategy in one or more of his trials, maybe all 4 of them.
Today on the show, brace yourself for the trials of Donald Trump. I'm Yasmin Khan, in for Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This episode is brought to you by Charles Schwab. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news right now. Hosted by Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, Washington Wise takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors. Tune in to learn about the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes, and trade. Hear about inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you're listening right now. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. You are listening while you're driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's really easy, and you can save money by doing it right now from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average. And auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year. So you're protected, no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
So before Donald Trump took the stand earlier this week, you tweeted that it was a lawyer's nightmare scenario, that Trump needed to explain his fraud allegations without committing perjury. Did he do that?
So I don't know what the truth is here, but if you look at the evidence as alleged in the very detailed complaint filed by the Attorney General here, that talks about these overstatements of value of properties, and then he comes in and testifies that those numbers were low. And so I think that he lacks credibility when he answers questions that way. And I think when a judge makes a finding about whether the statements of financial worth were overstated, I think they're going to find, based on the evidence, that they were. Does that amount to perjury? I think he will defend himself by saying that that's his genuine belief.
I mean, why would Trump testify at all? I mean, I understand the need to grandstand or that he's talking to a different audience other than who's in court, but he does have something to lose. So I'm wondering, what does he have to gain exactly by testifying?
Well, he's not testifying voluntarily. He was called as a witness by the Attorney General. So they put him on the stand. Now, he does have an option, which is to, on a question-by-question basis, invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. And in fact, at his deposition in this case, he did exactly that hundreds of times. But I think that in this forum, he probably calculated that invoking the Fifth Amendment here so publicly would be a bad look for someone who's running for president. Unlike a criminal case, where the fact that you invoke your Fifth Amendment right can't be used against you in any way, in a civil case, the judge can draw what's called an adverse inference against you. And so the judge could assume that because he declined to answer the question, the answer would have been bad for him.
So the former president has repeatedly shown up to court to sit in on the trial, even though he's not required to. And again, he's also facing 4 criminal trials. I think it's fair to say he's enraged by all of the cases, but I'm wondering, why do you think he's been so involved in this one and so clearly livid by it?
I don't know, but I imagine that his whole identity is tied up in these properties and in his public persona as one of the richest people in the world. And this case threatens to undermine that appearance. And so I think he is there fighting hard. And I think he is also there to create this circus-like atmosphere. I think he probably did what he wanted to do, which was concede defeat in this civil case and fire up, the strategy on appeal that this judge, in his view, quote, had it in for him and that they were likely to lose, but preserving his reputation in the court of public opinion of, doing it his way. And he believes that these numbers are right. And you can't prove that he believed he was wrong, and refusing to ever admit he was wrong. I think that was the calculus. And I think if that's the strategy, then he probably succeeded.
So as you've said, much of Trump's testimony revolved around defending his alleged wealth, right? Saying that his properties are actually undervalued, that their worth is far greater than what's even in his financial statements, the same statements that he's accused of fraudulently inflating. So what does it indicate to you that he appears to be doubling down in this way?
I think doubling down is really the only way Donald Trump can save face here and say to his voters that I did nothing wrong. They're out to get me. It's a witch hunt. But just to demonstrate the absurdity of this, one of his properties was overvalued by a factor of 23, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Certainly, there is some room for differences of opinion in the valuation of real estate. Say, for example, you owned a home that was valued at $100,000. And you get different appraisers. Maybe some say it's 90,000. Maybe some say it's 110,000. But no one would believe that the value of that $100,000 home is $2.3 million. That's the kind of escalation we're seeing here. And so for Trump to come in and say, oh, it's accurate, or in some instances it's actually undervalued, or they failed to take into account the value the Trump brand name adds, is really ludicrous.
What was interesting is that his sons, Don Jr. and Eric Trump, basically both testified that they deferred to their accountants, that they weren't really directly involved in putting together the financial statements for the company.
I'm apparently guilty of fraud for relying on my accountants to do, wait for it, accounting.
The former president seemed to contradict some of that in his testimony, right? At one point, he said, I would look at financial statements, I would see them, and I would maybe on occasion have some suggestions.
I think it's important that he says he did look at them. The idea that any of these three, by the way, weren't paying attention to these numbers when they were being marked to inflated in at least one instance by a factor of 23 strikes me as unusual. Certainly, accountants do their work. They pull together numbers, and then they would have a final sign off. If they are not looking at the numbers, they're not doing their jobs. I mean, they had high level positions in the company, and there's a reason they have to sign off on them. If all they did was completely defer to the accountants, there'd be no reason for them to have to sign off on them. Trump, on the other hand, I think wants to maintain the veneer that he's this hands-on businessman. And so for him to admit that I don't really look at the numbers, I just rely on the accountants, I think would be an admission he just couldn't live with. So I think he tried to walk a fine line there, would say, oh, sure, I looked at them sometimes. His defense more was that he doubled down on the numbers, that yes, I looked at them because they were right. And if anything, they were undervalued. And then his other line of defense is that the banks don't care anyway, and it's their job to do their due diligence. And if they thought there was something wrong with them, they should have said so. That, as a matter of law, the judge has already rejected. That is victim blaming. The reason you have to attest to a value is because it matters. It is a material representation. There are other borrowers out there who correctly assessed their worth, and as a result, they didn't get loans that you got. So there was a competitive advantage obtained by the Trump organization by misrepresenting these things.
So on Monday, Trump rested after testifying for 4 hours, and the defense didn't cross-examine him. Why not?
Well, I would say there might be two reasons for that. One is, if I were his lawyer, I would just be so relieved to get him off the stand and be done. Stop talking before you say something that is prosecutable is one. If you cross-examine him, it also opens him up to redirect by the Attorney General's office. So they may not want him to have to open his mouth again. The other reason is if they do want to use him as a witness in their defense, they can do that in their own case. They don't need to just cross-examine him now, which limits them to the scope of the direct questions.
I mean, I have to say, I'm not surprised by Donald Trump's belligerent speech, I guess, because that's what we expect from him, at least in political spheres. But I'm wondering if you're surprised that it's happening in a court of law and that it could repeat in criminal cases.
I am surprised to see him use this belligerent tone in court, but perhaps I shouldn't be. I mean, Donald Trump has shown us who he is for a long time, but I've never seen anything like it. I mean, certainly from time to time, a witness might get irritated by a question that's asked by the prosecutor and, might lose their temper a little bit. But typically, their lawyer will call for a break and calm them down and try to get them to answer the questions because they see themselves as doing themselves no favor. But, with Trump, I know that many times his supporters like it that he's sticking it to the man. And so maybe that kind of strategy can work for him at trial.
After the break, Trump won the presidency on his brand. Could this case destroy it forever?
This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Whether you're driving, cooking, or doing laundry, Progressive knows the podcasts you listen to go best when they're bundled with another activity, much like how their Progressive home and auto policies go best when they're bundled. Having these two policies together makes taking care of your insurance easier and could help you save too. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. That's a whole lot of savings and protection for your favorite podcast listening activities, like going on a road trip, cooking dinner, and even hitting the gym. Yep, your home and your car are even easier to protect when you bundle your insurance together. Find your perfect combo. Get a home and car insurance quote at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary.
I'm Josh Klein.
And I'm Elise Hu.
We host a podcast from Accenture called Built for Change.
Every part of every business is being reinvented right now. That means companies are facing brand new pressures to use fast evolving technologies and address shifting consumer expectations.
But with big changes come even bigger opportunities. We've talked with leaders from every corner of the business world to learn how they're harnessing change to totally reinvent their companies.
And how you can do it too.
Subscribe to Built for Change now so you don't miss an episode.
Something that's been very glaring in this trial is that both Trump and his attorneys have repeatedly criticized the judge. And on Monday, Trump attorney Alina Habba suggested that the judge had decided the case, quote, before we even walked up the stairs.
Not good for the case. This judge decided this case and liability before we walked up those stairs. I didn't have a shot. So right now we're sitting here doing a whole dance, and the only thing they want are facts that are bad for Trump.
This is a bench trial. The judge is the only person making a ruling here. What do you make of this decision to repeatedly attack the judge?
I've never heard anything like this with the statements that she made about how the judge is bullying her and, being mean to her. Judges own their courtrooms. They get to kind of call the shots in the courtroom. And so to go outside, one, to complain about it, it usually falls on deaf ears, but to then go outside while the case is pending and say these things publicly is just absolutely unheard of, especially because, the judge still has to decide the case and can control your destiny to some extent. So really outrageous, really unheard of. And it really just supports that theory that she's more about winning the PR battle than she is about winning the case.
So Trump's team hasn't just targeted the judge. They've also gone after his clerk, Allison Greenfield. And the attacks actually on Greenfield are what prompted the judge to issue multiple gag orders against Trump. Who is Greenfield and why is she being targeted?
So I think the only reason that Greenfield is being targeted is because of this photo that she posted on social media depicting her with Chuck Schumer. Um, I don't think there's anything wrong with someone posing in a photo with the senator for their state. But I think the Trump team pounced on this as an opportunity to portray her as a Democrat and someone who is biased against the case. I don't know that there's any real basis whatsoever to suggest that she is unfair or that she even has any influence in the case as the law clerk. Law clerk has a job to serve the judge, to help the judge in court, to do research when the judge needs it, to look things up on the computer when the judge needs it, to pass notes about the case, about did you want to take a break, about other matters going on inside chambers. And so I think the Trump team has exploited this photo to suggest that there's something improper here about the role of the clerk, that she is somehow pulling the puppet strings and that she is part of this, deep state operation that is hosting this witch hunt for Donald Trump.
Yeah, the whole thing about the notes that they've taken issue with, that a law clerk would pass notes to the judge, that has stood out as very bizarre to me.
I've seen this in court before, that sometimes lawyers will exploit the information gap that exists between lay people and people who spend a lot of time in court. I've seen lawyers, for example, say, in my 40 years of practicing law, this is the most outrageous thing I've ever seen. And you think to yourself, are you kidding me? This goes on all the time. But jurors don't know that. And so you start seeing them nodding along, but that something's outrageous when it's incredibly routine. And so the same thing, this idea of a clerk passing notes to the judge, I suppose if someone has not been in court before, they may not realize that. And so to the extent they hear Trump's lawyers saying this and getting outraged about it and putting it on the record, it may carry some weight with them. They may see that as evidence of improper behavior, when I think anybody who's ever spent a minute in court knows that clerks do that all the time. Sometimes they whisper in their ear. It's gamesmanship, and it's just, again, I think an affront to the rule of law.
So far, the judge has issued 2 gag orders against Trump and his attorneys. Trump has been fined roughly $15,000 for violating these orders. First off, how common are these types of gag orders?
Not common. Sometimes in a very high profile case, a judge might just sort of blanketly put a gag order in place against both parties because they don't want the case to be tried in the press. They want it to be tried in the courtroom. This case is a little different just because Donald Trump is running for president. And I think judges in all of his cases have been really reluctant to be too restrictive in preventing him from talking about the cases. But here, when the judge went after his clerk, I think that really upset him because, a clerk is not a person who seeks fame, who seeks to be well known, but they are really essential to the proper functioning of the court. And we have seen sometimes when Donald Trump casts aspersions on people, they become targets. So I think the judge has made it a point not to make statements about his staff in an effort to protect them, but really highly unusual that you would have to enter an order for singling out staff. I've really never seen a party or a lawyer go after staff like that before.
So the prosecution rests this week. Do you think that they've proved their case?
Well, I've always been reluctant to make a decision about a case when I haven't been in the courtroom because we see reporting, but we don't see every single statement. What we really see is the more interesting and the more explosive, like the Trump brothers and Donald Trump himself testifying. I don't know that any of those 3 really move the needle at all either way. I think this case is largely a documents case, though. And I think the accountants saying that they relied on the Trump organization to get these numbers is going to matter. I think that regardless of the baggage that he has, Michael Cohen's testimony is going to be persuasive, where he says, they asked me to reverse engineer the numbers. And so when we gave those numbers to the accountants, they were inflated. So, from outside appearances, it looks like they have proved their case. But again, I'm reluctant to really make a representation because unlike the judge who has seen every minute of this case, heard every word of testimony, I have had to rely on what's reported in the press to do that.
Given what we know about, or what we've discussed about Trump possibly using this trial as a PR move, that they've, forfeited this case in a sense, if the judge indeed rules against Donald Trump, how big of a blow would it be to him, do you think?
Well, he's got the appeal that's left. So I think that we'll see that come next. But if he were to lose on appeal and lose his properties, not only would he have to pay $250 million, which is a significant amount of money, but he'd have to remove his name from all of these properties. I think it'd be a big blow for him. His father had a real estate empire, but it was limited to Queens. And I think getting into Manhattan, which is considered sort of the fancy, sophisticated part of New York, I think has always been a big part of his image. And so I think it would be very humbling for him to lose those properties and lose the ability to, do business in Manhattan.
Right. I mean, he did testify at one point that he became president because of my brand.
Yeah.
So it seems that a great deal of his identity is at stake, at least.
I think a huge part of his persona is all about his brand. Think about the show The Apprentice, where he created this image of himself only better, of being wealthy and a decisive businessman. It certainly obscured all of his failed ventures, like his casinos and his university. His name on these big splashy buildings is very much a part of his identity as uber successful businessman that propelled himself to the presidency, self-made billionaire who started with only, millions from his father. I think it would be a real blow to his carefully crafted persona.
So Trump has 4 more trials coming up, criminal trials. Assuming he takes the same belligerent and even rule-breaking tone, what does this case tell us about what we can expect for those other cases to come?
I think this case tells us that we should expect 4 circuses to come, that Donald Trump will not go quietly, that he will not be like most litigants and follow the rules, that he will work to blow it up. That's been his MO from the start. He's a disruptor, and he will do everything he can to disrupt even administration of justice. And I think all of those prosecutors need to be prepared to deal with that.
In this civil case in New York, money is the punishment. Brand identity and potential loss of that is a punishment. But in those other cases, prison time is on the table. Could that force Donald Trump to try a different strategy?
I don't know. He seems to have one strategy, which is to always be on the offensive. It seems to have worked for him most of his life, and my guess is he won't change that strategy now. I think that for him, the best defense is a good offense, and I think we're going to continue to see that.
Barbara McQuade, I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Barbara McQuade is a law professor at the University of Michigan and a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. That's the show. If you're a fan of What Next, the best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. Go to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. What Next is produced by Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Paige Osborne, and Madeline Ducharme. We're led by Alicia Montgomery with a little help from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations at Slate. And I'm Yasmin Khan, in for Mary Harris. Find me on Twitter. I'm at Yasmin Khan. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.